Welcome. Folks, my name is Dr. Adi Vias. I'm a public health physician and the Lancet Countdown Oceania Fellow at the University of Sydney. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all and those who are on Zoom. I think there's a camera there or there. Thanks very much for joining us. It's a really momentous event for us, not only as a research of climate health folks, practitioners in public health and broader at the university ecosystem, but let me start, I'll get to that, but let me start by paying my respects to elders past, present, and emerging on the lands where we meet. We are on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. And I'll personally also reflect on my own journey, having worked across different parts of Australia in Ngunnawal land, where I started as a junior doctor, Noongar land, where I spent a couple of months working there during the pandemic, but also other places where I've lived, Wallamadigal land, as well as Camaragal land. So I think caring for country is very central. I think we'll accept this as part of any work in health, but particularly in climate change and health, where connection to country is central. So let me start there. Folks, we've got a fantastic hour-and-a-half session lined up for you. Bit of a late start today, but a scintillating panel discussion that'll come in the second half of this event. And we've got some wonderful keynote speakers as well. Let me just put 3 words in your mind as we start and kick off and settle into this session. For me personally, but also for our field, our discipline of climate and health, this is a momentous time. So that's my first M word for you. But it's also a time of mayhem. So the momentous comes from a national climate and health strategy that was published late last year for all of Australia, which we now have the challenge of implementing, which is great, a healthy and exciting challenge. We have at the highest level of international diplomacy at the UN climate change negotiations, UNFCCC, the COP28 Conference of Parties, last year had a dedicated health day and a health theme. So that's a watershed moment for us in health who want to influence climate change and not be left out of that negotiation process. They're 2 milestones. The third milestone is, I think, more closer to our hearts, and I'll acknowledge 3 people in this process. But the third milestone is the fact that this is the halfway mark of the international Lancet Countdown collaboration. It's based across UK and now across a number of regions around the world. And Australia was, dare I say, the first region that kicked off back in 2017-18. So the 3 people I would like to acknowledge from the very start are Associate Professor Paul Beggs, who's the director of the Lancet Countdown in Australia, in Oceania now, Associate Professor Ying Zhang, who's the co-director based at Sydney University, and also Professor Ollie J. Thank you for joining us and lending your capability here as host at the Heat Health Incubator. And of course, you're an author on the Lancet Countdown internationally as well. So everything's come together for us, folks. So let's get cracking right into the program. It's a great pleasure to welcome to the stage Professor Emma Johnston, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research for the Sydney University. She'll talk to us a little bit about climate change and health at the university, but a quick bio. Professor Emma Johnston is the DVCR, a highly awarded and world-leading authority in marine science and conservation. Her current research work focuses on global climate change, including marine debris, biological invasions, extreme events, and Antarctica's environmental future. She was previously Dean of Science and Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of New South Wales. Emma, please join us at the lectern and tell us a little bit about what's happening at the university. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear the room without a microphone? You need me to use one for the Zoom. I like being a rock star. Anyway, so this suits me fine. Can everyone hear me now at the back? Yes. So I too would like to acknowledge Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting today, acknowledge their elders past and present and their continuing connections to country, the continuing connections to country of all Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, and the deep wisdom that emanates from those connections. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today and to this very special event, which is the launch of the 6th, is that correct? 6th edition of the MJA-Lancet Countdown report on health and climate change. And it's quite remarkable that it is the 6th. I was speaking to some of the key authors just before we began today. And momentous is a great word, but also perseverance is another one. When the first report came out, it would have been coming out in a very different political context, received with far less attention paid to it, I think. There are some really positive signs at the moment, and I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome the author of our first national report on climate, or national strategy on climate and health, and that's a real milestone for Australia. I'm currently working as a technical advisor on the first national climate risk assessment for the country, the first phase of which was released recently, going into some deep dives now. And of course, there are many people working on the National Climate Adaptation Plan as well. So it's a little bit back to the future, because many of us were involved in these sorts of activities back in the early 2010 period, but at least we are now back on track and we are catching up in many respects. But it is important reports like this, the one that we are celebrating the launch of today, that help move not only the country forward, but our neighbours and the globe. So I'm delighted to welcome many distinguished guests. Am I clear that Dr. Jacqueline Small is here? No? Oh, that's a shame. The president of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians was going to be here, but she sends her apologies by the sounds of it. Professor Paul Beggs, director of Lancet Countdown. I know you're here, thank you, and lead author. Also Professor Ollie Jay, somewhere in the audience. Hi, Ollie. Our wonderful director of the Heat and Health Impact Centre, which is hosting the launch today. Thank you. Professor Jay is also an author of the Lancet Countdown report. So this report's now including 14 different organisations, as I understand it, including Australia, New Zealand, the UK, United States and Vietnam. So it's a true partnership. And of course, it's calling for urgent and sustainable action on preventing and mitigating the health impacts of climate change. If you've had a chance to read it, which I did on the weekend, it's sobering. It does provide some new insights. It identifies key areas where our communities, where our industries, our governments, our health systems all need to work together and to focus on these things. And I'll just call them out now. Building resilience against the health impacts of climate change, stopping funding to the fossil fuel industry, recognising the hard limits to adapting to climate change, and rapidly increasing renewable energy generation. And as co-chief author of Australia's State of Environment report, I wholeheartedly support these areas of focus, but I particularly welcome the attention this report brings to the various serious matter of how our physical and biological environments are so deeply intertwined with absolutely every aspect of human well-being, including our mental and physical health. And it's something that we, for the first time, tried to call out very clearly in the last State of Environment report. Sydney University itself is Australia's oldest university, first established in Australasia, but we do strive to remain young, and we do that by focusing our work on the very edges of the known universe. Our researchers are out there working every day at that edge, but they're also deeply engaged with their communities, with their industry partners, and with policy makers. And that's where the excellent research that is created at the University of Sydney is encouraged to and does transform for the public good. This is a great example of that. We do have world-leading experts in climate change, public health, environmental sustainability, and the net zero transition across society. And a lot of that research feeds directly into our transformative education, which is incredibly important because we are building the next generation of leaders in the climate change challenge, but also presents opportunities for us within the university. So we do, and we are very, very proud of the sustainability strategy that we have, which presents an opportunity for us to commit directly in the operations that we have to mitigating climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other unsustainable practices. But we also have a series of initiatives that we've been progressing as part of Strategy 2032, which is the Sydney University's latest strategy. And one of the ones that I'm most proud of, most recent, is the Sydney Horizon Fellowship Scheme. This is a scheme that supports early mid-career researchers to give them a secure academic position, but allow them to focus on their research activities for the first 3 years and then transition into a teaching and research role. The focus of those recruits, and there are 40 of them who have been successfully recruited in the first round, are on areas of climate, health, and sustainability. So we have recruited 40 of these incredible early and mid-career researchers, particularly to build our capacity in climate, health, and sustainability and the interactions between those areas. And you'll find that if you get a chance to meet any of the New Horizon Fellows, quite a few of them are working on the interactions between climate and health, environment and health, the built environment and health. So we're really, really hoping to build our activity and capacity in that space. We also have a really exciting new multidisciplinary institute about to launch, which is the Net Zero Institute. This already engages 150 academics across the university in all areas of technological and policy change required to reach net zero. I'm excited to say this team is about to launch, which means you're getting the early news, but in May we should be seeing very, very public announcement there. And of course, we have our existing flagship multidisciplinary institutes. One of the highest profile of those, the Sydney Environment Institute, which brings together thought leaders across the university and beyond to tackle the greatest challenges in environment. And we'll be hearing from some of the members today. So before I conclude, a few acknowledgements to esteemed colleagues. I've acknowledged Ollie J. Thank you for your leadership in this space. Professor Jamie Miranda, I think I saw you. Yes, Jamie, welcome. Head of our School of Public Health. Professor Miranda's only recently joined the school, but he brings a wealth of expertise in health and the sustainable development goals. We're delighted to have you join us. Dr. Madeline Skellen, welcome, Director of the National Health Sustainability and Climate Unit, and of course, as I mentioned, leader of the first ever National Health and Climate Strategy, published in December last year. And last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge the MJ-Lancet Countdown team. I hope I've got everybody here, Professor Paul Beggs from Macquarie University and two colleagues from the University of Sydney. These are the leaders of the team, Yin Zhang, Professor Yin Zhang, co-director of the Lancet Countdown Oceania, and Aditya Vyas. Is it Vyas or Vyas?
Yes.
Vyas, Dr. Vyas, Lancet Countdown Oceania Fellow. So this team led an event in the Australian Pavilion at the United Nations COP28 climate negotiations, which kicked off the first ever Health Day at COP28. Shouldn't have been the first ever, but we're glad that they were the ones that kicked it off. And that was, of course, opened by one of our own assistant ministers. So thank you to everyone again for joining. I'm sure the conversation is going to be highly stimulating. I highly encourage you to meet each other, greet each other, and work together, because it's a global challenge and we will only achieve great things if we are working very, very closely together, breaking down the silos and working with our communities in an engaged manner. Thank you again and welcome to the University of Sydney.
Thank you very much, Professor Johnston, for that wonderful welcome. Folks, we're now going to get right into the meat of what the problem here is for all of us collectively in climate change and health. Now, the first M word I said to you was around milestones, and Professor Johnston's also helped elevate that for us. The next one is mayhem. So there's incredible things going on in our natural environments, in our built environments, in our societies even, in terms of social structures and connections. A lot of that we have solutions for in health. And one of the fundamental things that's causing this problem, which we've referred to in this year's 2023 report of the MJA-Lancet Countdown, is around what we do with our energy systems, with our fuel sources, and how we treat the environment in that process. So I won't steal my next guest's thunder, but Professor Melissa Haswell, please do join us as I read out your biography and you get settled here at the lectern. Professor Haswell is Professor of Practice Environmental Wellbeing in the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Strategy and Services Portfolio and Honorary Professor of Geosciences at the University of Sydney. She's been teaching and researching infectious diseases, carcinogenesis, environmental toxicology, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and planetary health for 40 years. She's currently academic lead of service learning in Indigenous communities, SLIC, which sounds like an amazing program, and you've just come back to us just in time for this meeting from that teaching event. So thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure. Please go ahead and deliver our first keynote speech for the day. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you so much, Dr. Villas, and thank you so much to the MJA-Lancet team for inviting me here. I actually am very honored because I've been watching each and every edition of this incredible piece of work that you create each year, telling us what's going on as far as health is concerned and what a powerful voice we have in health. We should never underestimate the importance of our voice in this big challenge. So I'm going to take you across quite a wide landscape, and I'm going to do it fairly quickly. And I'm going to let the slides pretty much do the talking for me, because I think I definitely want to get to the end, which is the crux of the beginning that I'll be presenting to you today. So I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians upon whose lands we gather today. Of those where my work is completed, the Jinnabara people, and all those at risk from the oil and gas developments in Australia and globally, which is a very, very significant proportion of Indigenous peoples, unfortunately. So from the Gadigal lands spanning out globally, I'd like to pay my respects and also respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, who have cared for these lands of our planet for so many years. So fasten your seatbelts. This is a very complex issue talking about oil and gas and LNG. But what I want to tell you right now, it is now. Things are happening right now. So for example, I fly out to Darwin tonight to go to a Senate inquiry on Middle Arm Precinct, which would actually be the gateway to enormous gas production offshore and a new shale gas industry across the Northern Territory. Just wonder how many of you know about that. Okay, some do and some haven't, but it's something we should all pay very close attention to. So I just want to point out right here an incredible research effort in the United States that I have enormous admiration for. This is a publications arising from 2009. I jumped in about here, and it was fairly easy to to watch the literature. But over the years, that literature on gas and oil developments on health, environment, and climate has exploded. And I just point out here different times at which states and territories here in Australia did their reviews and made decisions on whether they're going to go ahead or not. So clearly they were making decisions on an immature evidence base, but I can say now that evidence base is really very strong because of this massive effort. And this is a report that we published late last year with my colleagues Jacob Hagedis, who's a young Gumbaynggirr man from the Northern Rivers, and also Emeritus Professor David Shearman. If you want to grab the report, you can grab it right there, right now, as you're sitting. Otherwise, it's on the University of Sydney website and also in the Analysis and Policy Observatory. And what this report does, it was a really sort of big labor of love, and it co-timed with a whole range of health professionals going to Canberra and meeting MPs and talking about this issue. So just very briefly on the report, because you can read it later, there's a chapter that's talking about the vast complexity of health concerns at every step of an extremely complex, invasive, and enormous footprint of an industry, which is unconventional gas or fracking. I don't have time to tell you all about it, but refer to the report. It's something we should all know about. In the report, it reviews the different ways in which chemicals from the industry get into the environment, either through water, also a heavy water drawing footprint, also quantity of water, as well as many, many opportunities for water contamination with a very wide range of chemicals, and also into the air. So we breathe, so human exposure, obviously through water, through air, as well as social disruption that occurs when a massive industry like that comes, especially to areas, remote areas, etc. So this is, if you want to read further, this is detailed in that report. Also, now quite mature range of direct health studies of quite elegance at this point in time, really showing that connection between intensity of exposure to this industry on conventional gas production and higher incidence of severe asthma in children, hospitalizations for heart, respiratory diseases, and some cancers, death and reduced life expectancies from those diseases, and all causes as well, mental health conditions, sexually transmitted infections, and traffic and pedestrian injuries and fatalities. That kind of reflects that complexity of the operations that are going on in the environment. And also at the same time, impacts on the developing fetus, increasing pregnancy complications, birth complications, interference with fetal growth and development, severe birth defects, and childhood acute lymphoblastic leukemia. All the chemicals that are identified have the potential to create these health impacts, and these studies have been so elegant at linking them through air and waterborne exposures. So that's the background to the health impacts itself. But at the very same time, oil and gas are fossil fuels. We all know that they need to come down quickly. And I love this terrible graph here, which shows if we had peaked fossil fuels in 2016, if we had peaked in 2020, we're still not really peaking. And that means the steepness at which we need to be in free fall, not gradual reduction, in free fall as far as carbon emissions. So because we didn't act in 2010, when it really became clear we were talking about something very serious, we now have a massive effort to do to keep global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees. And what has Australia done? This graph here shows on the side Australian energy production. And I want to distinguish this from what we use to power our lives. Yes, we use a lot of coal and gas, but the amount of energy we produce to export is mammoth. And what I particularly want you to look at there is the blue area is coal, and that red area there is natural gas. I don't know why they call it natural, but they do. But you can see how that widening amount of gas is now coming and creating this increase in our fossil fuel production when we know we should be decreasing. And this energy production is the largest contributor to our carbon footprint. And this is what it looks like if we zero in on the gas production itself. This goes from 1980 due to 2021. And you can see it's going straight up, especially around 2014 when that research started kicking in till today. And one of the reasons that has enabled this is liquefied natural gas. So it's kind of hard to transport gas itself if you don't have a pipeline, but this technique of LNG has enabled the stabilization and the increase in fossil fuels being shipped all over the world. And it seems to be a matter of pride for the Office of the Chief Environment if you go to their site and look at what they're saying about our fossil fuel production, even in 2022. So in a sense of, and looking around at Australia, you see multiple developments, not only the gas basins, that's been limited as far as unconventional gas to Queensland mostly, but these nameplate capacity is actually what we can do should we go for gas in a big way. And in 2023, we had 116 new coal, oil, and gas projects on the books, right? Not all at implementation stage, but clear commitment to developing those. And unfortunately, the US is also undergoing phenomenal LNG transition. So as they reduce their footprint with renewables, they're also turning 900,000 gas wells worth of gas into LNG to ship around the world. So again, we see this stabilization of the fossil fuel industry in LNG. And I'll just say very quickly here, we know very little about the health impacts of the actual LNG production process. It's pretty complicated, as you can see in the green there. And it's like being back in 2013 as far as what we knew about natural gas. Now we've got another very complex activity going on and potentially to be going on, already going on, and potentially more in Darwin, just 2 kilometers from the nearest suburb, a couple of kilometers from actually CBD. So we don't know. And yet we're seeing this massive transformation. Now, the point of what I want to say here is right here. We can do other things. So if you haven't read the Climate Change in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health discussion paper here from 2021, go ahead and read it. It has so much that we can do in this document, bringing forward Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges in the fight against climate change. And this is the main point that I want to be leaving you with today, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are leading much of what we're doing in terms of resistance to just letting this happen. And there's just some few examples right here from the Northern Territory, the Tiwi Islanders, the Mattawa Fitzroy River Council out in the Kimberley, the Torres Strait, and their complaint to the UN, Wangan and Dagalingo people who fought so fiercely against Adani coal mine, which became much smaller, and the recent win of the Gomeroi against Santos in their CSG development in Narrabri. And just to give you a few shots of who is this we're talking about, just really want to acknowledge this wonderful group, SEED, and Millie Telford there on the left right there, who's been a stalwart since 2010 at getting young people, Aboriginal people involved, alongside with the Australian Youth Climate Council, but letting Aboriginal people understand what's going on. The wonderful Larissa Baldwin, who was our Dr. Charles Perkins oration deliverer in 2022. That was right here at University of Sydney. And I love this quotation. She says, "We built community power," that's since Dr. Charles Perkins' days, "that turned into political power. And what we're offering is a better future, not just for us, but for everyone." Now, if we all thought of it like that, we would be vigorous in not promoting climate change. It's as simple as that. And just also showing the incredible efforts of the Tiwi Islanders, the Nurtalingi people in the Beetaloo Basin, which is slated for the first major shale gas industry in Australia, and also the Gomeroi people here. So in conclusion, I want to return to my acknowledgement slide, and I want to read the last statement here. I think we need to, in what we do as we move forward, acknowledging, promoting, supporting, getting behind the strength and leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the nation in protecting the health and beauty of the land we now call Australia. And I think that leadership of we're here for everyone is really critical. It's based on science across many millennium and must play a crucial role in helping us navigate an uncertain future. Thank you.
Very much. Good. Thanks. Thank you, Professor Haswell, so much for giving us that thread that started with Professor Johnston talking about the interlinkages between the environment, health, and then your very real, tangible demonstration of what this looks like through all the systems we create in society, in the economy, in industry. Let's bring that to what we're talking about here, which is around health. So I'm just going to move right on. Thank you, Professor Haswell, right on to our next keynote presenter. This was supposed to be Dr. Jackie Small, the president of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, but we have the wonderful Dr. Greg Stewart in her place. The slide had been updated, which is wonderful to see. And let me read a bit of a bio, Greg, as you join us at the podium. Dr. Stewart has, after 40 years in the New South Wales health system as a clinician, public health physician, and senior manager, retired in 2020 from his role as Director of Primary, Integrated and Community Health for South Eastern Sydney Local Health District. His roles have included CEO of the Wentworth Area Health Service, Chief Health Officer of New South Wales, and Director of Population Health Planning and Performance for Sydney's South West Area Health Service. Very fittingly, Greg undertook his medical training and a Master of Public Health at the University of Sydney, and he's a Foundation Fellow of the Australasian Faculty of Public Health Medicine and former faculty president. I feel like I have a much more colourful way to describe Greg, but I'll let you do that all by yourself, Greg. Thank you very much, and we'll leave you to it. Thanks. Just the next. Yeah.
Okay, I need to use the microphone. Thanks, everybody. And Jackie Small apologises for not being able to be here today. And as Adi says, I'm an ex-president of the Australasian Faculty of Public Health Medicine, a faculty of the College of Physicians, and in a lot of ways, the faculty that's been driving and has been behind the college's recent efforts over the last decade, at least in its policy development and its actions on climate change. So I've been asked to speak on the role of health practitioners and medical colleges, and I'll do that by talking about what the College of Physicians is doing. But first, I do want to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land here today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present, and acknowledge emerging Aboriginal leaders. And the RACP recognises that the healthcare system and the country more broadly must respect and learn from First Nations leadership and cultural knowledge in our climate change adaptation and resilience efforts. I'll get onto this in just a second, but I just do want to reflect on what's happened in terms of health and climate change, global heating. I should call it, from global heating and response to global heating and health over the last decade or so, because up until, as Adi said, COP28, there was kind of no recognition that health was a really key issue in climate change. And that's not without want of effort from colleges and from lots of people in this room. What's happened in Australia in this last decade of 2012 to 2022 is that we just had outright climate denial. And now, of course, you can't deny the science of climate change. So then the next step is to say, well, it's going to lead to enormous economic disbenefits if you actually act on climate change, which of course completely denies that there'll be enormous economic consequences if we don't act on climate change. And it's great to see that the report, the 6th now, deals with that in one of its 5 sections. The college has been involved in the Countdown report since the start, and is also involved later on in the year in the policy brief that will come out to guide further action, to advocate further action so far as climate change is concerned. Obviously, climate change and health are an urgent priority, and I'm going to talk about the climate change and health work that the college has been doing over at least a decade longer, and opportunities to engage. So climate change itself is a priority policy area for the RACP. As a member-led organisation, the members with expertise in climate change and health drive our policy and advocacy work, and this includes input into the policy brief each year. And in recent years, we've had increasing engagement with specialist medical specialist societies like the Society of Cardiology or renal physicians, and a lot of work has been happening in that regard in terms of mitigation and to some extent adaptation. Got to go back. Our 3 policy statements I have up here on the board: climate change and health, environmentally sustainable healthcare, and the health benefits of mitigating climate change. These have been the foundation for the work that the college has been doing. It's not just health departments that we engage with. We also engage across government. For example, earlier this year, we provided advice to the Australian Treasury, emphasising the need to quantify the costs of climate change on health and the economic benefits of taking action to inform climate health policy. Further building climate resilient and climate friendly health systems was an important part of our pre-budget submission to the Australian government, which the college does every year. And late last year, we engaged with the Department of Home Affairs on a national crisis response, which also outlined the need to build healthy and climate resilient communities and health systems to decrease climate risk and disaster vulnerability, so across government. And that's the college sees its role in that regard. And over the last year, the RACP has made several submissions and advocated for action to protect health from fossil fuels by urgent transition to renewables across the economic sectors. We're so glad that finally there's a national health and climate strategy. College has been advocating for that for a long time through its engagement with CAHA and otherwise. We certainly welcome the release of the report, because finally we have a document upon which we can develop solid actions to take, for further response to climate change and global heating. And we valued the opportunities we've had to provide input into the strategy's development, including through the Chief Medical Officer Advisory Group, which Jackie, the President of the College, was a member of. Our key submission had broad engagement from our membership, and the clear message was the need for a strategy that prioritised population health and community climate resilience alongside a focus on healthcare systems. And there's also a focus on high-value care and optimising models of care to reduce emissions. And that's another strength of the climate strategy, and goes hand in hand with the RACP's Evolve program, which is part of a global movement to drive high-value care. The RACP works closely with members of specialty societies to produce top 5 lists of recommendations to reduce low-value healthcare, and this also results in reduced greenhouse gas emissions. The Healthy Climate Future campaign is a campaign the college initiated and is now advocated for by 13 colleges and a range of specialty societies. The timeline up in front of you here, 11 specialty societies, and the campaign includes a joint statement last year, which received significant media coverage. Campaign also focused on ensuring a national strategy that's guided by First Nations knowledge and leadership, fosters healthy and climate resilient communities, and equitably decarbonises healthcare. So far as professional development is concerned within the college, because colleges are obviously interested in the professional development of their members, the college is dedicated to supporting professional development of members, including on climate change and health. We have a comprehensive curated collection of various pieces of work, and a professional development podcast mentioned here on healthcare in a volatile climate, and many relevant educational videos available to members through Medflix, and recordings of past events. And an e-learning resource is under development, and we'll draw out from the research report that the college has done in the last year or two. College itself has an environmental sustainability policy, and which reflects our commitment to becoming a more environmentally sustainable college. And we've taken active steps in energy efficiency, water usage, multiple waste management areas, and reduced travel. And lastly, there are opportunities to engage across the healthcare sector. We encourage everyone to support the Healthy Climate Future campaign, and RACP members who can join within the college policy and advocacy groups that continue to advocate for a response to global heating. So really, in conclusion, the health threats of global heating are already here, as we all know. Health professionals have an important role to play in advocacy and action, and medical college membership can help share the community's understanding of climate and health and build on the momentum of Australia's recently released strategy and on the findings of this year's Lancet report. Thanks, Adi.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Stewart, for sharing what comes after the first M of milestones, the second M of mayhem, which I didn't finish explaining to you, right? But we got right to the management of these issues. So thanks, Greg, for sharing that experience of what the College of Physicians is doing. What I meant by mayhem is this. In our 2023 report, which our next speaker will tell us about, we noted that there were 2 critical events. I think we all know. In 2019-20, there were the big summer bushfires on the east coast of Australia. The estimated insured losses from that to society, to insurance companies, were something like $5 billion. But we had a COVID pandemic after that. And after that, we had flooding, again, up and down the East Coast. And on that occasion, the estimated losses were closer to 7 billion, actually 7.1 billion or so. So what is happening in our environment is compounding impacts that are felt at the hip pocket through our finance system. They're also felt in terms of health impacts. So I think the reason why you're here is to learn a little bit more about the MJA-Lancet Countdown. So it's a great pleasure to welcome to the stage Associate Professor Paul Beggs. I'll quickly read out your bio as you get set up, Paul, but we now have some highlights from the 2023 report. Associate Professor Beggs works at the School of Natural Sciences at Macquarie University. He's the director of, as you know, the Lancet Countdown Oceania Regional Centre and lead author of this year's report. An environmental health scientist by background, he's worked in biological and climate sciences and is an international authority on the impacts of climate change on allergens and allergic diseases. He was elected a fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society in 2023. Welcome, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Addy. Hopefully you can hear me. I've got a different projection device connected to me. It's a delight to be here, and thank you so much, everyone who's come along today. Remember? No. Here we go. Okay, so before I get into my presentation, I too wanted to acknowledge that the University of Sydney's Camperdown campus, where we are today, sits on the lands of the Gadigal people, and I recognise and pay respect to the elders and communities of these lands, past, present and emerging. So the 2023 MJA-Lancet Countdown report was published on the 25th of March, just a couple of weeks ago, online, and then appeared in the 1st of April issue, which you see the cover of over on the right-hand side of this slide. And we were delighted once again to see that we had actually been featured on the cover of the latest issue of the MJA. So this is a really great way for us to be profiling our work, and we continually thank the Medical Journal of Australia for their great support of our work. I wanted to start today by acknowledging the team that I work with. No one person can do this report. It's an extremely broad report, as I'll talk about a bit later, and it requires a team of, as you see here, 25 leading experts from around the country and beyond. We have experts here from pretty much every state and territory, missing the Northern Territory and South Australia at the moment, but every other state and territory is represented. We have 3 Indigenous authors on our report. And indeed, as we heard earlier today, we have several really amazing people from overseas institutions as well, the US, the UK, Vietnam, and New Zealand. And the people here represent a whole range of different disciplines, everything from health and medicine through to environmental science, climate science, and economics and beyond. And again, we require that diversity of expertise and disciplines to put the report together. So just a personal thank you from me to all of the amazing people here. They are outstanding, and that is why the report is so well received, I think. For those of you who have not accessed or read the report so far, you can have a look at it. There's the DOI link. It's open access, so anyone in the room, anyone on the planet can access and read the report. And you can also go to the MJA website itself, and the report is still highlighted on the MJA homepage. Let's get into some of the detail of this year's report. Broadly speaking, we look at indicators of health and climate change, and we look at those indicators across 5 broad domains, as you see listed here. We look at the climate health hazards, exposures, and impacts. We look at climate adaptation, planning, and resilience for health. We look at climate change mitigation actions and health co-benefits. And then, very importantly, we also look at the context in which this health and climate change is occurring. So the economics and finance around health and climate change, and also the public and political engagement in health and climate change. So we're looking at the impacts of this great threat, but also the responses, adaptation and mitigation, and also the economic and political context. I don't have time to go through all 25 indicators, but I've packaged together a few of them to tell some of the most important stories from this year's report. One of the things that the report importantly looks at is the connections between diet, health, and climate change. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see the results from one of our indicators, looking at greenhouse gas emissions from food production in Australia by commodity from 1995 to 2020, the most recent year for which data are available. So you can see the big picture in some ways is that there's been a very gradual, slight decline over this 25-year period. So that's a good thing. But we still have a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions from our agriculture sector. So from food production in Australia. And the other thing staring you in the face is the red, light blue, and pink colour. And that is the greenhouse gas emissions from beef production, lamb production, and the production of dairy products in Australia. Over on the right-hand side of this slide, in the upper right, you see the results from another indicator that's related to this, looking at the diet of Australians and diet-related mortality in this country. And our results show that high red meat and processed meat consumption and insufficient consumption of fruit and vegetables accounted for about half of the 87,000 diet-related deaths in 2001 alone. So this actually presents Australia with an enormous opportunity. Correction of this dietary imbalance would not only reduce the number of deaths related to these high red meat consumption, but also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production in Australia. So this is one of the really important co-benefits that we really need to make use of here in Australia. We also look at health and economic costs of climate extremes. So Adi was just talking a bit about this. Over on the left-hand side, we look at the displacement of people in Australia from climate-related extreme events. And our most recent report looks over the period 2008 through to 2021. Again, the year that we have data for. You can see a concerning increase in the number of displaced people over this time period. So the number of people being displaced is definitely going up as time goes on. And indeed, the most recent 2 years, 2020 and 2021, a step up from what we saw previously. So 2020, as we just heard, was due to the severe fires that we had at the beginning of that year, displacing tens of thousands of people. And then we had the switch to heavy rains and flooding in Australia in 2021. And importantly, this displacement of tens of thousands of people around Australia each year is related to adverse health outcomes, both physical health and, importantly, mental health. And over on the right-hand side, we see the economic losses in Australia due to climate-related extreme events. This is simply the insured losses. The actual losses are far greater than this. And again, as Adi just said, in 2022, we hit a new benchmark. So over $7 billion of insured losses due to climate-related extreme events. And that 2022 figure, again, is due to flooding in 2022. Our report looks at 25 indicators, as I said. And some of those are going in the wrong direction, as we've just seen, but some are going in the right direction. So we do find signs of progress in Australia, and we need to celebrate those successes. First and foremost, as we've heard today, Australia's first National Health and Climate Strategy was published at the end of last year. And I was delighted to be in the audience when it was released at COP in Dubai. So obviously the MJA-Lancet Countdown has been calling for this for a number of years, but many others have as well. So the RACP and so on. So it was a great testament to the new unit that we have the director of here today, the National Health, Sustainability and Climate Unit, that this report came out after the unit had only been in existence for less than a year. So we are delighted with that strategy and we will be tracking its implementation into the future. We also see that there is increasing community engagement with health and climate change in Australia. So the number of electric vehicle sales almost doubled in 2022 compared to 2021, albeit from a low base. And there was a 65% increase in the coverage of health and climate change in the media in 2022, again, compared to 2021. So I think the Australian community has turned the corner, and certainly we engage with the media and various others to promote health and climate change to the community. But this is the overall conclusion, the overall takeaway message from our report this year. So the urgency of substantial enhancements in Australia's mitigation and adaptation responses to the enormous health and climate change challenge cannot be overstated. Again, as we've heard today, this is now extremely urgent that we act in both adaptation and mitigation. And Australia's energy system, and that includes the healthcare sector, currently emit an unreasonable and unjust proportion of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we need to mitigate more urgently and adapt more urgently, especially in our energy system, but also in agriculture, healthcare, and many other sectors. Before I wrap up, I also wanted to mention that in this year's report, we also are consciously broadening the scope of our report and also advancing some of our indicators. And we have 3 text boxes, which I really encourage you to read, that focus on 3 areas of this broadening and advancement. So first and foremost, in the top bullet point you see here, we have a text box measuring climate change impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and well-being. So that is written by our 3 amazing Indigenous researchers, and it really points the way to a new indicator in the report, hopefully coming in next year's report. And that will be very much looking at Indigenous connection to country and very much led by not only Indigenous researchers, but also Indigenous data as well. And the other 2 boxes that we have in the report look to our neighbours, New Zealand and Vietnam in this year's case. So we have a section looking at the unprecedented rains and flooding that occurred in New Zealand at the beginning of last year, and also broadly looking at health and climate change in Vietnam. As I said, this is a conscious broadening of our scope. So the MJA-Lancet Countdown is now part of the Lancet Countdown Oceania Regional Centre. So we will be continuing to focus on Australia, but also more broadly in our region. So the Lancet Countdown Oceania Regional Centre is part of an integrated global network of Lancet Countdown regional centres. So there are others in Latin America, Europe, Asia, small island developing states, and we are at the moment developing a centre in Africa as well. So the next 5 years is going to be a really amazing time for the Lancet Countdown through the global efforts in each of these regional centres. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Friends, we have been listening to some 4 excellent speakers telling us about the kind of swathe of activity that goes on. And Paul very kindly shared with us, I think, what some of the solutions are. We've got rigorous data, we've got evidence, it's time to implement it. So my 3rd M for you was around management, right? And managing this climate disaster or the climate crisis. I wonder if there's just as a lively exercise, is there a show of hands of people who've heard this phrase, managing the unavoidable or avoiding the unmanageable? There's a couple of hands. There's a couple of hands. And online, I'm sure there's 50 hands. In fact, folks, there's about 70 people who've joined us online, maybe closer to 80, I understand, and about 50 people in this room. So that itself is a wonderful showing. So thank you, everyone, for joining us to learn more about this issue. Managing the unavoidable essentially looks at climate adaptation. So there's certain actions we have to take. We can't avoid taking them. And a lot of that happens in our workplaces. For example, if you're in the health sector, you go to work tomorrow and you might have an environmental health emergency you might deal with as a public health practitioner, just as an example. Or if you're a clinician, you might have to do something different when you have a large number of people presenting with heat-related illness during a heat wave. But it's also the avoiding the unmanageable, i.e. mitigation, prevention of climate change-related health impacts that we're interested in. We wanted this to be quite lively, and this is probably my most favorite part of such events because we can actually this is a bit of a fireside chat, right? We'll talk through some of your work, learn about not only the Lancet Countdown indicators, but also how they interact with everything you do. So the way we'll run this session, and if you have questions, do bear them in mind because there'll be a chance to ask the questions directly if you're in the room, or if you're on Zoom, please use the question and answer session part or the chat session part to post some questions, and we'll take them at the end. So what we'll do is we'll have 5 minutes from each of these speakers to tell us about their work, how the MJA-Lancet Countdown indicators relate to that, and then we will move on to the questions and answers. So we'll probably go in this order. I'll introduce our speakers one by one, starting with Dr. Madeline Skellen, who it's a great delight to have, and she's been name-checked by a few of our speakers, rightly so. She's the Director of the National Health, Sustainability and Climate Unit within the Interim Australian Centre for Disease Control, operating as part of the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care. She led the development of Australia's first National Health and Climate Strategy, and there's a few copies in the room for those who want to pick it up, published in December 2023. Madeline worked for many years in England as an academic health economist and in a variety of roles in the English National Health Service before returning to Australia to take up her current role. Madeline, can you tell us maybe just 5 minutes or so about your current work and how you might have integrated some of the research and data findings into the national strategy?
Yeah, thank you, Adi, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm really, honoured to be invited to speak, but also just wanted to say I'm really humbled by the mentions of the National Health and Climate Strategy in the presentations to date, because we see ourselves in the National Health, Sustainability and Climate Unit as owing a great debt to both the MJA-Lancet Countdown, but also the Global Lancet Countdown in a range of different ways. Firstly, building the evidence base, especially in relation to measurement and development of those indicators, which were so influential in our thinking. And that's something that we're hoping to extend in the coming years within government in terms of developing a framework for routine data collection and monitoring of climate-related exposures and their association with climate-sensitive health outcomes, as well as impacts on health system resilience. Also, though, I'd just like to name the role of the Lancet Countdown initiatives in defining climate and health as a unified policy area, encompassing both health system sustainability, kind of adaptation, resilience, identifying the benefits in terms of health, in terms of economically of action, and also, within Australia, bringing together that coalition for action, especially in terms of the professional societies, different professional groups. And finally, recruitment. We do have 2 members of our team in the national unit who are graduates, so to speak, of the MJA-Lancet Countdown. And that's no coincidence, because actually there aren't a ton of people working within Australian governments at any level who have great expertise on climate and health. So it's initiatives like MJA-Lancet Countdown, CAHA, Doctors for the Environment, and also the Public Health faculty of RACP that have really been the incubators of expertise in relation to climate and health. And it's a great honour that a number of those people have moved into government, working with me to develop Australian climate and health policy and strategy. So in terms of what our strategy is delivering, we developed actions within the strategy under 4 key objectives that I'll just briefly outline. And I wanted to do that because those 4 key objectives in many ways define the scope of the activity that we are hoping to undertake in the years and potentially even the decades to come. We have 49 actions that we've committed to delivering over 5 years. those actions are good. Some of them are great. Others are, as far as we got at the time. But really, there's a wider program of work that we think needs to be undertaken that goes beyond those actions. So firstly, in relation to building the resilience of the health system to respond to the health impacts of climate change. So that's not both the resilience of the functioning of, not only the resilience of the functioning of the health system, but also building that ability to build population resilience to the health impacts of climate change. Secondly, a net zero health system. So that is a health system that's sustainable with net zero emissions, but also still delivering high quality care for patients. And we believe that high quality care and low emissions care go hand in hand. Thirdly, international collaboration. So just as climate change is an international problem with international origins, so too the response needs to be international. And our work there is firstly about collaborating internationally to build a sustainable climate resilient health system here in Australia. So for example, collaborating with the international collaboration on healthcare supply chain decarbonisation initiated by the United States and the English National Health Service. Secondly, working internationally to define new international standards for carbon footprinting of health technology products that hopefully can be embedded in health technology assessment processes in years to come. But also we have a role to play, and we're delighted that this role has the support of our ministers and senior leadership within Australian government in promoting sustainable and climate resilient health systems internationally, and especially within our region, within the Asia Pacific. And we're delighted to be working with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on that. The fourth objective under which we're developing our, under which we're kind of have a work stream is what we call health in all policies. And that essentially means two things. Firstly, it means identifying, catalysing, prompting the rest of government to undertake those wider adaptation actions that are needed to address the health impacts of climate change. Because most of the health impacts of climate change, as we know, won't really have anything to do with what the health system is doing or its impaired ability to respond. It will have to do with the way that climate change impacts those wider determinants of health through air quality, through kind of housing, through all of those other channels. So we've got a range of actions in the strategy that involve collaboration across government to take adaptation actions to address the health impacts of climate change. And secondly, promoting the health benefits, the health co-benefits of emissions reductions across society. Because if we're not going to do that as the health system, as health professionals, no one's going to do that. So in relation to diet and nutrition, I love, Paul, your content in relation to that, in relation to travel and transport, in relation to air quality. And indeed, it's very interesting that many of those kind of topics in terms of promoting the health benefits are the same topics where the wider adaptation actions are really needed. So I just wanted to finally kind of finish by saying we're keen to collaborate with all of you in the room here and also online in delivering the strategy in the coming years, but also in identifying what else needs to happen in the coming years to build a sustainable and climate resilient Australia, but also promoting that internationally. So, thank you for the invitation to speak today, and look forward to working with you in the coming years. Great.
Thanks, Madeline. That's a wonderful summary. How can you translate 100 and something page document into 5 minutes? That's an example right there. I particularly liked how you talked about health in all policies, which has been such a foundational concept. Whenever you go to your first Master of Public Health subject, you'll probably learn about that. So thanks for bringing that to the fore. Professor Ollie J, over to you. I'll just quickly introduce you though, and we'll hear a bit about your wonderful work. And of course, thanks again for hosting us today. Professor J is Professor of Heat and Health at the University of Sydney and Director of the Heat and Health Research Incubator. I know you've had a wonderful show of support from this institution, so you can tell us why you're not an incubator anymore and going on to bigger and better things. Just a quick few things about you. Professor J holds an NHMRC investigator grant and has led several large-scale projects that have directly influenced international public health heatwave policies internationally. In 2021, Ollie co-led the first ever series on heat and health in the Lancet. You can see it's one of our partner journals. And he's a contributing author both to the Oceania as well as the global Lancet Countdown annual reports. Ollie, over to you. Please share some of your own recent work and maybe some linkages to what Madeline's told us.
Thank you, Addy, and thank you for the opportunity to host this event. today. And thanks to Felicity for doing great work helping us put this event together. So maybe a quick round of applause for Felicity. She's our Centre Manager for the Heat and Health Research Impact Centre. So I'll start off by just describing a little bit more about the indicators that are in the MJA-Lancet Countdown report with respect to heat and health, which is my speciality. Now, in the global report, we have a greater suite or a greater number of indicators. There are 5 heat-related indicators in the global report. But in the MJA-Lancet Countdown report this year, we have 2 that are specifically related to heat. So the first one is exposure of vulnerable populations to heat waves, which is particularly relevant in an Australian context and becoming even more relevant internationally. And then there's a second indicator, which talks about the way in which extreme heat or hot weather impacts safety during physical activity. So in the first instance, I'll just talk about the exposure to vulnerable populations. So the way that this particular indicator is developed is that it leans on something called the excess heat factor. Now, not many people will necessarily know what the excess heat factor is, but many of us will be influenced by it because since 2022, the Bureau of Meteorology used the excess heat factor in order to determine whether to declare whether a heat wave is being forecasted or not. And the excess heat factor is dependent not just on the peak temperature on a given day, but it gives you a running average of the 3-day mean daily temperatures. And the reason this is really important is that relatively recently it's been identified that it's not just the peak ambient temperatures during the day that align with health impacts, it's the overnight minimums. So when we experience very high overnight lows, so warm overnight temperatures, this generally has been demonstrated to contribute or compound the health issues that we see with respect to extreme heat on health outcomes. And over a 3-day period, what we find is that if we have hot daytime temperatures followed by hot overnight temperatures, this cumulative effect results in a more severe impact from a health perspective. So this indicator uses the excess heat factor approach to try to demonstrate how heat waves have been changing over time. Now, using this approach, there's a 50-year trend that is detailed in this year's report. And what we see when we look at just the exposure, so the weather, we see a 35% increase in heat waves over the last 50-year period. That's what the 50-year trend demonstrates. Now, one thing we can do then is take that information and normalize it for population density. We can understand, we can have hot weather, but if there's nobody exposed to it, then there's less of a health impact. But what we find is when we normalize this exposure to population density, we still see a 28% increase over the 50-year period, which is very alarming indeed and really aligns with the health data that we've been seeing. The second indicator is the one related to heat and physical activity. Now, this is one that I'm personally involved in. We've got Dr. Troy Cross here, who helped co-author that indicator with me this year. So thank you, Troy, for that tremendous work that you've done. Troy's also a co-author on the global report for this same indicator. And so what we do with the heat and physical activity indicator is that we leverage some work that we've done here at the University of Sydney. Dr. James Smallcombe is sitting at the back. He's a postdoctoral fellow, senior postdoc in our group. And James, along with myself and the Chief Medical Officer for the Australian Olympic team and Tennis Australia, Associate Professor Carolyn Broderick, together we developed the Sports Medicine Australia Extreme Heat Policy back in 2021. And what we did with this particular tool is that we identified certain temperature and humidity thresholds above which heat stress risk during physical activity would be elevated. And what this does, it gives us an easy way of identifying conditions that would expose people to greater risk when they're engaging in physical activity. It's important to think of physical activity and sport of being really a cornerstone to Australian life. If we think about the number of kids that are engaged in physical activity every year, it's more than 70% participate in sport in more than 3 times a week. So this is something that really is at the root of the Australian way of living. So using this approach, what we found is that in the 5-year period between 2018 and 2022, if we compare the number of days that have had at least 1 hour above this heat stress risk during the times that we're expecting people to be engaging in physical activity. The increase relative to the start of the 1990s, so the 5-year period at the start of the 1990s, we've seen between a 16 and 24% increase in the number of days that are presenting this elevated heat stress risk. So again, things are going in the wrong direction with respect to these particular indicators. Now, I'll just quickly finish off because I know we've got 2 other speakers and more to get through, just to give you a very quick summary of what we're doing here in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. The Heat and Health Research Incubator, or Impact Centre, we're going to be renamed. It's a level 2 research centre that really focuses not just on understanding the level of the problem and the mechanism of the problem, but really focusing on developing solutions. Because one of the big problems is that people are losing hope, people are checking out because they're just being inundated with negative information all the time. And we want to provide people with a little bit of agency to try to find ways in which we can all contribute to finding solutions to this crisis that Adi has very eloquently described throughout the course of this particular session. So we look at the way in which we can find solutions for the way in which extreme heat and hot weather impacts human health and well-being across the human lifespan. And we organize our activities according to 5 distinct priority research themes. These are child and maternal health, physical activity, sport and occupational health, aging and chronic diseases. We've really focused on utilizing landscapes in the built environment. We've got Dr. Federico Tartarini, who's a new Horizon Fellow, who's just been awarded. Professor Johnson mentioned the Horizon Fellowship program a little earlier on. And so Federico is leading that particular research theme. And then finally, we have the humanitarian settings theme that really focuses on developing solutions for people in different humanitarian settings for the impacts of extreme heat and hot weather. So that's all I've got for you right now, but I'd be very happy to speak to anybody who is interested in the work that we are doing as a team. A lot of the team are here today, so please flag us. And if you're interested in learning more, we'd be happy to discuss with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ali. That's what a host of work that you're leading here, and it's fantastic, and it's world leading. And I know also there's members in the audience who have directly collaborated with you to actually put those solutions in place, for example, at New South Wales Health. So, you know, it's in our communities, it's in our state, it's international as well. So thanks for highlighting that solutions focus. Now, we'll move on to the next speaker. And I guess we're kind of going, not by any specific intention, but we're moving from a national lens to a slightly more international flavor to our work, because of course we live in an international setting where carbon that's emitted on another part of this planet affects us and vice versa. So I'll introduce our next panel member, Professor Jaime Miranda, who's professor and brand new head of the School of Public Health at Sydney University. Prior to his move to Sydney, he was full professor at the Department of Medicine and founding director of Crónicas, the Centre for Excellence in Chronic Diseases, both at Universidad Peruana in Lima, Peru. I cheated. There's 2 more words after that, but my Spanish is no bueno. His work brings together epidemiological and health policy aspects of chronic non-communicable diseases in low and middle income countries with a focus on obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and mental health. Jaime, you've joined our academic community here and brought a really, I feel, if I may say personally, quite a fresh approach to how we do things. Maybe you can comment on your work, particularly around the Sustainable Development Goals. I can see your lapel pin there. And I don't know if you'll go talk about the political aspects of that, because I do notice the color choice of your crochet work, which is teal. And when you came to Australia, I think the teal wave would have hit politics through our national election. So please tell us what you'd like to tell us.
Hola, hola. Here we are. Yeah, Spanish is okay, eh? Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jaime. Yes, and I come, and the natural reaction and adaptation to this role is to maintain this international lens of the amazing things that are happening here in Australia and how to facilitate and convey that sensation that you're far away, but equally the things that are happening here are worth sharing. And the first reaction to that one is the obvious one. So we're here in this land, in particular this zip code, with the lowest mortality on the planet due to COVID pandemic. And that result is not chance, is a result of a lot of work and effort, but it's not an overnight result. And that in itself is a lesson that ought to be shared throughout the world. So when you feel that things are difficult here, my invitation will be things are much, much more worse elsewhere. And let me give you an example of that. In the first year of the pandemic, Peru changed 6 different ministers of health. During the first 18 months of the last presidency, before he was sacked, we like sacking president. Our last 10 are in prison, so it's not political, it's right. And one of them escaped, but he committed suicide. So during the first 18 months of the last president, that person had to appoint or reappoint 75 different cabinet ministers. So imagine, how can you govern, or how can you direct and guide an institution, for that matter, a country, in those circumstances? So one of the things that you take for granted, guys, is whether you like it or not, the elements of political stability that you have here that allows you to have this platform like this and continuity and engagement. You might dislike it, but you have it. Some other places we're wondering, when is the time that we could have that peace of mind? Not only resources, and we're talking about funding, we're talking about human capital to engage, to connect, to be proactive. So that's another of the lessons that I think you take for granted. And then number 3 is the amazing work that you're doing in terms of the Aboriginal population. That effort of being conscious, not only of health in all policies, but also to what extent are we trying to reduce the inequities and the gaps that we have with these underserved populations. That's another very rich opportunity to connect globally. So my invitation is, don't be shy. Don't be shy, and please, the platforms such as this, Lancet Countdown, and sharing your story and sharing this narrative is essential for the world. And letting now transition to why is essential. I got involved in these sustainable conversations more recently. So in 2020, I got an email and I was trapped here in Australia. I came on a sabbatical. I couldn't leave for 3 years. That's part of my story. I got one of those emails. It was from the UN. I used to delete those, delete. I said, this is a scam, maybe coming from somewhere. And they say, Jaime, are you on it or not? And I say, what is it? Your government has nominated you to be one of the scientists, to be part of the scientific advisors to the UN Secretary General. And this year, last year, 2023, is halfway through, is the evaluation halfway through the 2030 agenda. So when the Sustainable Development Goals were established, and this is the one that I got it for this, it came with a companion monitoring and accountability system that it fed directly to the UN Secretary General, which is interesting by design. So every 4 years, the entire planet provide these updates. So halfway through the agenda, getting a team to be connected and to get to know each other online, very difficult to get to know different disciplines, but we have to come together. And what is it that brought us together? Obviously, we were not going to say the obvious things, that obviously our track has been decreased, slowed, we're not gonna make it, even reversed. So that's a half empty or half full type of analogy. But the other one is that despite whatever metric of success we use towards the 2030 agenda, there's momentum, as you were using. There's mayhem, but there's opportunity to coalesce. And the 3 words that brought us together and we're trying to steer to the entire UN systems is, or are, the transformations are inevitable. And you remember that, transformations are inevitable. And the good thing is we can shape that. We can shape those. We live through transformations historically and more recently, and we embrace them. And if collectively we have this other element of capacity to coalesce and capacity to decide, an agency to prioritize and to make decisions, that's when changes occur for the positive. And I think this is a very unique moment for us, academia, for government sector, for the country, and for all of the world, because we're on this willingness to share, willingness to learn from each other, and willingness to transform good lessons. So in terms of the research and academic side, we're learning a lot of humility. a lot of how to connect better and integrate better with the policy decision making. We're serving very well our role of producing the best possible evidence. And I think the next stage will be how to bring those evidence into the right spaces at the right times to bring people to coalesce and to live through those standards that transformations are inevitable, but we can shape it. I invite you, I will stop there because I invite you to read our report. It's called the Global Sustainable Development Report 2023. There are too many reports that we've been named. Let me, a bit of a plug for that one. GSDR, Global Sustainable Development Report 2023. And it's an invitation. And I have to admit, it was one of the most difficult reports to write in my career because the audience is so broad. So who are we targeting it to? Who are we going after? And can we not lower the bar in terms of quality, but can we enhance the bar in terms of readership and having something for everybody? So halfway through the 2030 agenda, things look green, more difficult, but also opportunistically, we have the moment to coalesce and make the right choices and the right decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jaime. Bringing together that thread really nicely from the governance that we started by talking about the national strategy, which we now have, Ollie's solution focus, and then now you're bringing us to the fact that we should be quite mindful of what we do have on this lucky country, right? One thing you talked about is capacity, which is a wonderful segue to our next speaker. Associate Professor Ying Zhang is a senior epidemiologist focusing on climate change and global public health, and she's been doing this for about 20 years. She's the co-director of the Lancet Countdown Oceania, so it's great to have you on this panel, Ying, and the founding chair of the Sustainability, Climate and Health Collaboration Group at this university, and the chair of the Capacity Building Subcommittee of the World Health Organization Civil Society Working Group on Health and Climate Change. So really wonderful to have you here to share with us where we go now on capacity building, because we have reports, we have an ambition and intention in this room and beyond. Where do you think we should take that? How do we get there?
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Paul and I have been working on this MJA-Lancet Countdown for the past 6 and 7 years. Just one point before I talk about capacity building is that I'd like to acknowledge and appreciate the long-term partnership and support from the organization that we've been working with, especially in co-developing the policy briefs through the years, including the IACP, Australian Medical Association, CAHA, Doctors for Environment, and Australian College for Nursing, and Australian Indigenous Alliance Health, and very importantly, Australian Medical Students Association and PHAA. And so without your support, we cannot disseminate and increase the impact of our work, because our work doesn't stop as the publication of the report. So we want to see the changes that we would like to see over the years. So that's a official acknowledgement from us for our partners. And also, I think some people mentioned the solutions and the opportunities that we can take in responding climate change, including building a climate resilient and net zero health system. And as an essential part of that is the capacity building for health workers to respond and prepare to climate change and extreme weather events. At the university, I think we all have the obligation and responsibility to educate our students and as a future health professionals to understand the scale of the problem, to understand what is needed to respond and how we can work together, basically to be prepared and think about the dramatic, like the transformation that we need to be prepared to protect people from climate change. That's very important. So the goal is to have all health professional students to be educated and trained about climate change and health. And we are working towards that, and we have made substantial efforts to develop our curriculum and training programs to achieve that together with our partners. And I'm so pleased to see some of the students in the room, as we have had the past launch events as well. So they will be the champions to lead the change we need for the future. That's important. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ying, for all your work around this. I wonder if my mic has turned off. Just checking my mic. I think it's, there we go. Okay, friends, let me do a quick check. Are there any questions for us on the Zoom call? We'll do a quick check of that. And I wonder if there's any questions in the rooms. Any hands up if you'd like to ask a question? And we have a microphone we can pass to you. Otherwise, I have about 100 questions for the panel myself. But we probably don't have time for 100. So I wonder would any of the panel members like to just reflect on what you've heard so far in relation to our theme today, which, thanks Jaime for actually mentioning this. I should have done so myself. It's about coalescing around a common purpose and something like a new era. I think we are very much in Australian climate and health in a new era for action. We have a national strategy. We have academic partners with really strong solutions that can be implemented. We have a global framing and we have the capacity building tools now. So what does that mean for policy, research, and practice? And the coalescing part for me is quite important. How do we integrate it and bring it all together?
I'm sure.
Please.
I'll have a go. So a couple of things I'd like to comment on really to start off with. One thing that I've seen a lot, and I think a lot of my colleagues have seen a lot of, is this tension between people working in the mitigation space and people working in the adaptation space. And often there seems to be this viewpoint that you can't do both, or by working on adaptation, you are surrendering the mitigation. And I think we need to have a really detailed, multidisciplinary viewpoint on this particular case, on account of the fact that, according to climatologists, is that as a legacy of the decisions that we've made to date and our actions to date, there is already a certain level of warming that is baked into our climate system, which will result in inevitably warmer weather over the coming decades. Now, of course, we can do something to affect that trajectory, and we must do, of course, and that's the mitigation part of the equation. But still, there are already many vulnerable populations here in Australia, globally, that we need to focus on building resilience for. So by working on adaptation doesn't mean that you shouldn't be working on mitigation at the same time. And I think both of these streams of activities are equally important for different reasons, but they are collaborative as well. And one of the last things I'll say about this is what we really need to make sure we're doing is, when we're thinking about adaptation to a warmer future, is that the activities that we are engaging in are not contributing further to the problem down the road. And this is, from a cooling perspective, one of the big challenges that we face is that it's seen, air conditioning, mechanical cooling is seen as this silver bullet. And while it is very effective, it's also very environmentally damaging. And we need to think about ways in which we can work with that to reduce the impacts of our adaptation responses right now.
Thanks, Ollie. I wonder if there's a response to that on the panel itself.
Thank you. I'll go with that. I think I'll go back to your point about coalescing here, right? And I think the question about how do we coalesce will cross the boundaries of what's in it for me. And I think we have to be honest and have honest conversations on the what's in it for me, particularly for us in academia and government and other parties. And I want to connect that with my earlier reflection about the humility that what's in it for me may be different and of what is needed today. So sitting where I sit now as head of a school, I have to look after a number of beautiful group of people whose needs and demands are entirely different to perhaps what's needed for things like this. So, and I think an important and humble reflection of the what's in it for me and be prepared to make that extra effort that today, if we want to coalesce, it means doing something different than you've done previously in the past, and how to acknowledge and support that. We have to cross that uncomfortable zone, because what's in it for me may not necessarily be great for your academic progression, but it's essential for the progress of society. So, and I suppose that's on our end, right? So do we need more publications to commit policymakers? Not necessarily here in Australia. I think you need to implement and perhaps to evaluate or to facilitate the implementation of this national strategy to reach every single one of the populations. And that will come at a cost, at a professional cost. So we have to be quite honest and upfront about it.
Just let me reflect on that, Jaime, because that is a central tension. Two central tensions we've heard. Firstly, the one around adaptation mitigation, really two sides of the same coin, as Ali told us about. And then Jaime, now personal, can we use the word sacrifice perhaps, or perhaps not, but personal choices we make in our career trajectories, in the way we operate our governance systems as well, and how we engage with that, whether it's academic governance or indeed government governance in the bureaucracy. I know there are two questions in the audience. Shall we go to the questions and then come back to you, Madeline? I think Melissa was first, and then we'll go to Michelle.
Thank you so much. This is just stimulating all kinds of thoughts in my brain. And one of the things I really worry very much about is the increasing health and wealth inequality in this planet now, but even more so, what should bring us together should be at 2050. That's where we're going to distinguish between, did we do something or did we not? Did we do enough or did we not? And the one thing we all share, or most of us share, is love for our children. Why aren't we putting love for our children at the front of these discussions? You don't hear it anymore. They used to be in the definition of environmental health, and it got knocked off at some time. Why do we think it's okay to think we're the last generation, which is sort of like where we're at? Why aren't we using that to connect with everyone on the planet about the future, at least most people?
So you're talking about intergenerational equity, which is often spoken about in perhaps other disciplines, not necessarily the discipline focused on climate and health. I wonder if there's a response to that really critical question on the panel.
I think Oli has mentioned that there's life course approach that we are taking in examining the health impact of climate change or, extreme events. We should have prioritized the high-risk populations in our public health approach and more generally health approach. But I think it's also the risk communication messages here that it's not only about our future, it's not only about our children and grandchildren, it's happening now. It's relevant to everyone now, here, everywhere. So that's why I think we should probably think about strategies to balance the risk communication messages that could achieve our goals there, if I can partially address your comments.
Can I briefly just to add to that? I think it's an important observation, but my response will be on the optimistic side. The fact that such need and such presence of youth and voices is not here, or at least in the documents, doesn't mean that there's an absence of people not caring. So thanks to the work that we've been kind of interacting with a multiplicity of factors, the most adamant, the most keen, the most demanding in terms of, please give us that report with that, because that will be our material for us to advocate, was the youth people. So if they are not here, they are somewhere else and they are doing something about it. So that's my optimism.
Yeah, if I could just say something on this, I don't have anything profound to add to the question, to say on your question. Just wanted to acknowledge that we, in developing the National Health and Climate Strategy, recognise the central importance of applying a health equity lens to the whole strategy, and that includes considering the welfare and impacts on future generations. So that means that in terms of our decarbonisation strategies, we need to make sure that those strategies also at the same time tackle health inequities, or at least do not exacerbate them, because that can happen. But secondly, that in targeting our adaptation interventions to address the health impacts of climate change, we need to be thinking about which communities are most, most at risk of being impacted by climate change. Since the strategy that we've just published is, the first step in a long road of developing the Australian health system response to climate change, I think I can't point to more at the moment than the acknowledgement of that high-level principle, but I'm hoping that in the more concrete kind of policies and initiatives in the year to come, that commitment to an equity lens will be reflected in what we do.
Thanks, Madeline. That's sure. Yeah, it's great. We're getting questions coming in thick and fast, so we're getting the ball rolling. Thank you very much, Melissa, for that question around equity at the center of what we do, and Madeline for that nice response at the end there, that these are processes that we've thought about as we develop the approach moving forward. Now, I think Michelle Isles has the next question. Michelle, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Isles, the new CEO of CAHA, the Climate and Health Alliance. I think my original question was answered, and coalescing suggests to me that there is movement, that we need to continue to be both nimble in our thinking, and that obviously this terrific and fundamental research is shifting and responsive to the environment and the cultural and political changes that are happening. But I was thinking about the interdependence of the international and the national and, of course, the local in terms of policy directions. And I think there is perhaps a tension between policy and direction at that international and national level, and how we, to Melissa's point, bring people along, ensure there is equity and participation in that movement, especially in the face of climate disruption. So I wondered if you could just comment on that, perhaps the gap between the national and the local, and how we could address that.
I feel like that's a question for Madeline.
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. And it's a challenge that we face as the Commonwealth government, because we want to kind of set an overall direction and, in a collaborative way for Australian climate and health policy going forward. But we recognise, I think this issue, I hope it's not wrong to say, it comes to the fore above all on the adaptation side. I think, the health impact, the impacts of climate change and the health impacts within that will be fundamentally experienced differently by different communities in different geographical areas in Australia and globally. And so what that implies is that the responses to those impacts need to be locally driven as well. So it's probably true for decarbonisation as well, but it just seems really clear to me on the adaptation side. So while we are very actively engaged as the Department of Health in working with our Department of Climate Change on the National Climate Risk Assessment and the National Adaptation Plan and developing the health components of those, a key priority for us over the next year or two is going to be developing guidance and implementation support tools to enable local health systems, local health service organisations, primary health networks and so forth to undertake climate risk assessment and develop their own adaptation plans in a way that's locally appropriate. To do that in an appropriate, useful way is going to require a lot of engagement. And in particular, we've made a commitment to also developing those tools in a manner that's useful for the Aboriginal community controlled sector. And we recognise that is a whole separate area of engagement that we're going to need to take very seriously. So I suppose just again, as I did with Melissa's question, just to acknowledge the general principle, and that's very present in our work and thinking. And then the question is, how can we as the Australian government add value to support those local adaptation initiatives and the health system response to climate change more generally?
Thank you, Madeline. Ollie, I wonder if you might have also some comments on the, shall we use the term bottom up, or, what solutions on the ground can we implement where people are having direct impacts from climate change?
Sure, yeah. I think the way I'm thinking of your question is that maybe the root problem is twofold. First of all, it's getting people to understand what the impacts are going to be. And that's a real challenge. We talk about 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, 2 degrees Celsius of warming, mean global temperatures, and people have a real hard time articulating what that means. And most people are thinking, what does that mean for me? And that is balanced up against the all the other things that they have to consider throughout everyday life. So I think embracing new ways to try to help people understand what the consequences of our decisions today are going to be in the future is really, really important. That kind of speaks to Melissa's point as well. How are the decisions we're going to be making today going to impact our kids when they're our age, etc. Just to briefly talk about some research we're doing here at the University of Sydney that is trying to lean into that a little bit is on the 9th floor, we have a climate chamber. And in that chamber, it's a state-of-the-art facility where we can simulate any kind of heat wave. And what we actually do is work with climate scientists to simulate heat waves of the future. And what they can do is tell us what different heat waves of the future are going to look like depending on what the climate emission scenarios are that we follow based on the decisions that we make and the policy actions that we take. And using that approach, we can actually demonstrate what it's going to do to people because we expose people under careful clinical supervision, of course, to these conditions. And it shows how much it makes people hotter, how much more uncomfortable it is to do something that we take for granted now, like a typical work task, how much more vulnerable an elderly person would be, how much more dehydrated people would become, how much more cardiovascular strain they'd experience. And using that information to use almost a different language to try to articulate what these impacts are going to be in the future. The second thing speaks to one of the things that Jaime mentioned in one of his earlier responses, this idea of people I think it's fair to say, think about what's in it for me. And so this idea of incentivizing adaptation strategies. So another piece of research that we've been partnering on and helping lead over the past couple of years is this idea of trying to incentivize people to use air conditioning less. But most people are not going to sacrifice what we call thermal comfort for that. But we're pioneering this idea of a fan-first cooling strategy, whereby people use a accelerated air movement as the first line of defense instead of turning on their air conditioning. And what this means is that the temperature which you feel uncomfortably warm is actually elevated by about 4 degrees Celsius. And if that now translates to you switching your thermostat of your AC unit to start turning on to cool at 26 or 27 degrees Celsius instead of 22 or 23 degrees Celsius. What this means is that your air conditioner will turn on later in the day, it will turn off early in the day, and it'll be on for a shorter period of time. When it is on, won't be working as hard. And the greenhouse gas emission reduction associated with that, the energy consumption reduction associated with that, and the decrease in cost for operating your air conditioner using that approach is about a 70% reduction. And this all happens without sacrificing thermal comfort at all. People will feel just as cool, but their bills are going to be 70% cheaper in the summer when they're using air conditioning. And this is a win-win type of scenario. And there's lots of those potential solutions that are, I think, out there where we can really kind of embrace what the incentives are for people and utilize those to find solutions that will benefit everybody.
Great. What a fantastic response. Any follow-up to that?
No. Well, that's another question.
Yeah. So just to comment on that, Ollie, as well, because, you know, for example, I can see some hands popping up. Thank you. For example, what you've just told us about the fact that higher temperatures on your thermostat, you can still achieve a similar amount of comfort, financial benefits, environmental benefits. Can we say social benefits?
Yeah.
Social benefits might come from the fact that the energy grid is not overloaded.
And it makes
you
it
don't
more
have to have a
affordable
brownout,
for more people.
right?
Yeah.
So we're talking, in fact, about the triple bottom line. And for your colleague to your left, that's the sustainable development pillars, the 3 pillars of sustainable development, the financial bottom line, as well as environmental and social. So thank you for that wonderful example. There's a couple more questions popping up in the room. Any quick responses from the panel to that? No. Over here, please.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Professor Corinne Caillot from the School of Medical Sciences. And I think what I wanted to add is potentially more a comment from what you said, just Melissa, and maybe followed by a question, actually. What I wanted to share is that I'm doing, I've got a program of research in the Pacific Islands, and I'm interested in obesity prevention and interested in how young people could have better lifestyles. But when you get started on talking about diets and physical activity in countries who are already experiencing climate change, the conversation is both very complex, but when you talk to young people, it's quite amazing. Because I think, you know, we're working around scenarios and we wanted to have a scenario where we're talking about the future when we realized that for them, the future was already there. But I'm learning a lot. We are learning a lot, and we're still looking at the data, but I think it's critical to engage with the young people. It's critical to engage as well because I think they're a bit less pessimistic than adults maybe, and they are more prompt to look towards solutions and really to engage in that conversation about, let's talk about what we could do and how we can adapt. And I think as well, there's a very strong link with building capacity because a lot of them are really keen to engage in programs, education, research to understand how they can actually change their future and act for their future. So yeah, thank you for your comment. And so maybe my question is, how much are young people already potentially involved in those conversations and reports?
Good question. And I wonder if the answer from the panel might be not enough, but I don't want to prejudge your answers. Ying, yeah, that's a good starting point.
Yeah. I don't have the data to give you an exact answer as an epidemiologist, but at the last COP in Dubai, there was full room full of passionate students. There's a student lead pavilion where the students were passionate and capable and really speak out about what they can do and how they can be engaged using their own words. And we are, impressed by how powerful their words can be. For example, the student-led strike, there's no argument about the ethical concerns, but we cannot ignore their voice and their power in leading the change in the climate actions and discourse. So also we can see the students' faces here, and they are very keen. I have, the number of in my classroom on climate change and public health that Ollie and other guest lecturers contributed to have more than tripled compared with the number before COVID. And I can clearly say that the students' engagement and passion and eager to learn more about climate change is definitely increasing. So we need to meet their needs by adjusting ourselves to understand what we can offer to support them. That's very important.
Yeah, well, obviously, young people are at the forefront of social movement activism around climate change globally, and that's something to be celebrated. And I just wanted to name a challenge that we experienced, which is probably a challenge across policy areas within government, which is engaging young people in the consultation process to inform development of our national health and climate strategy, probably because of the deficiencies of our own processes and ways of thinking and, the kind of style of outreach and the types of fora and topics. We struggled to have success in that area. We engaged with Australian Youth Climate Coalition and the Australian Medical Students Association. They attended some of our workshops, they made submissions, we met with them, but I would have loved to have done more there. We worked really hard to get Seed Mob along to one of our workshops, never quite succeeded. Yes, and I think we are thinking about how, so as part of the strategy, we are kind of reviewing how our governance structures work to, promote collaboration both within government, but also beyond it to support implementation of the strategy and the wider Australian health and climate policy response. And we're very clear that we need to strengthen our engagement of young people in all of that. But just wanted to name that is probably an ongoing challenge for us, thinking about how to create spaces and modes of engagement that are interesting for young people and that are able to amplify their voices.
Thanks, Ben.
Well,
A quick one.
I'm going to be real quick. There's an excellent educational opportunity available this evening. Emma Bacon from Sweltering Cities, sitting right here, is going to be speaking at the Raising the Bar event this evening at 6 o'clock. Where are you? Where is it? At Fortress Bar, right, Central Park. So sign up. Emma's organization does some tremendous work, and it's a great opportunity to learn more about that.
Fantastic, Ollie. Thank you for that important plug with another colleague and collaborator in the audience. Now, friends, I have a very sad duty, which is to say, but a happy duty. Unfortunately, we can't take this last question that's in the audience because I'm standing between you and some networking drinks outside, which is time limited in its ability to serve you. So if you don't mind, we'll bring the panel to a close. I know there's lots more we can discuss, and please do so after this event. Please join me in thanking our panel members, Madeline Skellen, Ollie J, Jaime Miranda, and Ying Zhang. Thank you for your time. All right, friends, I won't labor the point anymore other than to say thank you so much for joining us this year. Our MJA-Lancet Countdown team, MJA-Lancet Countdown in Oceania, it's going from strength to strength. And one of the key things I've heard from the panel is engagement. So get involved. Let's coalesce around this new era for action, and let's go forth. Thank you very much again. Thank you.